Hey guys, how's it going? So I am here to talk about A Mad Love, An Introduction to Opera by Vivien Schweitzer. This was just published in 2018, and Vivien Schweitzer is a music and an opera critic for the New York Times, and she herself is a classically trained pianist. So she knows what she's talking about clearly, and she also knows how to write clearly, based on my reading of the book. But this is just a very short but surprisingly comprehensive history of opera, an overview of the basic elements integral to opera, and also just a straightforward linear history of opera, and a discussion of a lot of the major issues that have been important throughout opera's history. And the way that she structures it is she goes through just a straightforward linear history of opera, starting in 1607 with the debut of the Italian composer Claudio Monteverdi's opera L'Orfeo, which is about Orpheus and Eurydice. And that was the first, not the first opera, but the first really successful opera that really kicked off opera as an art form and started the craze for operas that seems to never have ended. And yeah, she just moves forward from there. But before I move on, an interesting point here is that the origins of opera, the deep origins of opera, are actually from a mistake, because in the Renaissance, everyone in Europe wanted to be like the ancient Greeks and Romans, right? And a lot of people mistakenly believed that Greek drama was sung. So that's why we got opera. And in fact, opera for a long time was known as sung tragedy, not as opera. So, thank goodness for that mistake, because we got opera out of it. But so she moves forward from there and structures the book along a linear history. So after Monteverdi, she talks about Handel and Mozart and just the beginning stages of opera and sort of it getting its feet under it. And then she moves into the development of a bel canto opera, which, for anyone who doesn't know, bel canto operas are just operas that focus a lot on catchy melodies, very sort of conventionally beautiful melodies. So these are composers like Bellini and Rossini. And after that comes the rise of what she calls the giants of the 19th century, the two real titans of 19th century opera, Giuseppe Verdi and Richard Wagner, and also the rise of the conductor as a sort of personality and as a really important part of the orchestra in this period. Chapter after that covers Verismo opera, which is sort of realistic opera, quote-unquote, to the extent that opera can be realistic, and she talks about that, how it's sort of an oxymoron to say that there's any such thing as a realistic opera, because there are already, you know, characters standing on a stage singing about their lives, which never happens in real life. But still, realism, and this is where she talks about Puccini at length, Giacomo Puccini, one of the greatest opera composers. And these realistic operas were about everyday, normal people with everyday struggles. Often, you know, like the quintessential one would be like La Boheme by Puccini, which is about these very poor artists who are in love. And this is in contrast to the operas of like Wagner and Verdi, which were often about either aristocrats or nobility or royalty, or about some gods or mythological figures like in Wagner's Ring Cycle. And so the Verismo operas were in contrast to those. And following that, Schweitzer goes into the 20th century with the rise of dissonance in opera and atonality, which is just music that doesn't use the tonal system, which I can't really go into here. But you know, the composers like Richard Strauss and Alban Berg, and she also talks about the progression of opera in terms of the subject matter that is covered in it, because like Richard Strauss's two most famous operas, Salome and Electra, are very violent operas. You know, Salome ends with a woman basically making out with the severed head of a man. She also discusses the progression of the subject matter of opera and how shocking it often was at first, but how it sort of progressed forward. And after that, she goes into more contemporary opera, late 20th century, 21st century. She talks about the epic minimalist operas of Philip Glass. She talks about a lot of the political operas of John Adams. And finally, she does a sort of generous little overview of some 21st century operas. And just talks about a bunch of composers, so I can't really go into any individual ones. But throughout this history, along the way, she's always describing different terms that were important, like bel canto opera and like verismo, and like what an aria is, you know. But what I think is best about it, what she does best, is her passion always really comes through, and the way that she talks about each individual opera of each composer. She describes both the music and the story of the opera, and what I love is it always made me want to see the opera. And I just want to give one example, and it's of the one I want to read to you is her description of Philip Glass's opera Einstein on the Beach, which is a musically minimalist, which basically means that the music is sort of reliant on repetitive rhythms and textures that develop very, very gradually over a long span of time. But her description of this opera is very strange, but it totally hooked me. So she says of Einstein on the Beach, there is no discernible plot or coherent libretto in the opera, which is scored for amplified ensemble, a small chorus, and soloists who sing and speak text consisting of numbers and soufflage syllables. Einstein's theories are alluded to via the manipulation of musical time, with an abstract stream of consciousness libretto that includes enigmatic poems written by a young man with brain damage, numbers repeated in various sequences, and references to the Beatles, the pop song Mr. Bojangles, and the trial of the heiress Patty Hearst. Einstein is divided into 4 acts, which are bridged with short connecting pieces that Glass called knee plays. In knee play 1, the chorus intones the numbers 1 through 8 over the drone of an electric organ, and text uttered by 2 soloists, creating a surreal tapestry of sounds. The mood changes abruptly in the propulsive, breathless train, whose momentum is driven by the saxophone and keyboards. In a live performance, the character of Einstein is portrayed by a violinist, whose solos include the hypnotically beautiful knee play 2. The sense of existential angst that permeates the opera culminates in Act 4, with the relentless ascending and descending scales and frantic soaring voices of Spaceship evoking a nuclear holocaust. Yeah, I just love that. That made me really interested to see that opera, although I'm not sure I ever will be able to, because I don't know how often it's staged, and I don't know if there are any videos available, but yeah, you find that everywhere in here, in all her descriptions of opera, from, you know, Tristan and Isolde, to L'Orfeo back at the beginning, to Handel's operas, just everything talked about with so much passion. I love it. And throughout this history as well, she makes a point of talking about why specific operas were very impactful and often very controversial at their first debut. You know, in particular, just as an example, she talks about Wagner's opera Tristan and Isolde, which today is, you know, absolutely a classic of the repertoire. But at its debut, it was not very well received because throughout it, Richard Wagner uses a lot of dissonant music. And for anyone who doesn't know, dissonant music is this music that where the scale that's being used for the music has notes that don't really click well together, don't sound like they should be together. This music tends to be very unsettling and uncomfortable. And Richard Wagner uses dissonant music throughout this opera. At the time, in the 1800s, the convention was that if you had dissonance, it needed to be resolved with consonance, which is which is more common in music, which is where the notes all do, you know, sound nice together, and it's much more beautiful sounding in a conventional sense. But Wagner did not do that. He used a dissonance throughout this whole opera. And for anyone who's seen Tristan and Isolde or ever heard of it, it is quite a long opera. So, you know, people are treated to 4 or 5 hours of dissonant music. And at the time, this was just, you know, not well received. But obviously, Tristan and Isolde has gone on to be very influential in the 20th century with the development of atonal music in, you know, Alban Berg and Arnold Schoenberg, among others. You know, there are discussions like that throughout the entire thing, and, you know, I can't go into many more. But along the way, she also discusses other just general issues, not necessarily having to do with the development of opera, but just with issues with how opera's staged, with how which operas become canonical as well. I found that discussion particularly interesting. She talks about you know, how long it takes an opera to become a part of the repertoire, and what decides whether it becomes a part of the repertoire. You know, like Tristan and Isolde, not all operas are well received at first. Sometimes they're sort of a slow burn. They'll be forgotten for a while, but then they're revived, and suddenly people realize that a particular opera is a masterpiece, and then it becomes a part of the repertoire. And my favorite example of this was when she talked about a lot of the great bel canto operas, like the operas of Vincenzo Bellini. Those operas, actually, for a long time, were not a part of the repertoire. They kind of fell into obscurity, well, maybe not obscurity, but weren't staged very often, and weren't a part of the repertoire. Until the mid-20th century, when Maria Callas, who was this great soprano singer, performed some of them, and really brought out their brilliance in her vocal performance and her acting performances. And you know, among these operas now is you know, Bellini's Norma, which is, you know, absolutely these days considered a classic of opera. So yeah, I found that discussion of like which operas become sort of canonical, to use the more literary term, very interesting. And you know, you see that when she comes to the 21st century as well, because she talks about a generous selection of 21st century operas that have premiered, and she's in that section. She's more critical of some of them, but we would expect that, right? Of operas being staged now to be more of a mixed bag, because even operas that were debuting back in the 1800s, the vast majority of them, you know, were forgotten and are no longer staged. You know, Tristan and Isolde and Verdi's La Traviata are pinnacles, but the vast majority of operas will not be remembered. And so you would expect that contemporary operas, we would be more critical of them. You know, we don't know what modern operas will become a part of the repertoire in 50 years, and she emphasizes that. You know, some of the operas that she's critical of, for example, she talks about Brokeback Mountain, and how the music in that opera really kind of fell flat, really didn't live up to the emotional gravitas of the story, because, you know, if any of you know the story of Brokeback Mountain, it's a very tragic love story between two male cowboys. And this music, she says, just didn't live up to the, you know, emotional impact of that story. But who knows, you know, in 10, 15 years, Brokeback Mountain might be revived, and we might all realize that it's a masterpiece. We don't know. But, yeah, anyway, I could go on, but I'm not going to, because this video is going on for a long time. But I love this book. I think it's a great primer for budding opera buffs, such as myself. You know, what's also great is that there is actually a list of suggested reading in the back that Vivien Schweitzer provides you with, which is wonderful. It's a nice healthily long list, and you know, I'm sure I will be making my way through it at some point. And at the very least, you'll get a lot of recommendations for operas in here. And as I said, they will be described with a lot of passion and eloquence. And yeah, if you're into opera, or if you want to get into opera, I can definitely recommend this book. So yeah, anyway, thank you for watching, guys, and I will see you in my next video. Bye now.